Kia ora. Hello and welcome to Liberty Now. I'm your host, John Verd. Thank you very much for stopping by. This is the show for discerning minds and common sense. We seek the truth and can think for ourselves. I'll be here dropping truth bombs every Saturday at 10 p.m. and chatting with you about stuff that matters to you and me and everyone we know. And today we're having a conversation with one of those thinkers, a deep thinker named Holger Horiga. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yep, that'll do.
And yeah, it's a pleasure to be talking with you at length today, Holger. We have a common friend, Ellie, who's a nutritionist, and I understand you also do a lot of holistic healing work yourself as well. So it'll be interesting to talk about that. Today's topic, we're going to talk about The Brave New World versus 1984, which should be interesting for anybody who's read either or both of those novels. And is it a self-fulfilling prophecy or blueprint? So we can go a lot of directions with that. But Holger, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Be interesting to see where this leads.
Yeah, well, I like to explore these ideas, and think, in philosophical terms as well as, what's happening geopolitically. I'm also a fan of the writings of Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Power of Myth. We've read some of the same books. You've read both Brave New World and 1984 in particular. But before we dig into that, Holger, tell me a little bit about your background.
Yep, I grew up in East Germany, like in the 70s, 80s, still in the middle of the Cold War, and I only knew that world from that side of the fence until we got to the late 80s, when the system started wobbling and then finally eventually collapsing, and I was right in the middle of that one at that stage.
Yeah,
but I've been in my late teens, been in the Air Force already, basically watching the collapse of that, what used to be my country, basically, or my home.
Yeah. What was that like, breaking out into the world? I mean, there must have been a lot of myths or things you believed about the outside world that you had no way of knowing. I mean, what was that like?
Yeah, well, we lived in an interesting, like, compared to, let's say, for example, people in Poland or the Czech Republic, we had the advantage that we were right next to West Germany, right?
Yeah.
So we could receive West German television, radio shows. Our American friends had the radio in the American sector, the RIAS 1 and 2. They would definitely make sure we get all the
right.
information from their side. So we did have a bit of the privilege of having seen both sides. So we actually grew up very skeptical of our government.
Okay.
And I think that's carried over to me now. So I'm very skeptical of anything that calls themselves government, because I've seen it working on both sides. I've seen the communist system. I've lived long enough in this system now. I'm not quite sure what we call this, end stage capitalism, I suppose.
End stage capitalism. I've never heard that term. Boy, that sounds.
If you're Marx, there's a Marxist kind of terminology. You have the early stage capitalism and end stage capitalism going into monopolism, which is what we're basically having now.
Yeah. Technocracy, or rather oligarchy.
Technically, yeah. So according to Marx and then Lenin, the next step should be the demise of that system, and then the superseding of the new system. But we'll see.
Yeah.
Well, that can be another 100 years.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm still a firm believer in, free market capitalism. I often think of it sort of as the Amazon rainforests, where you have such an amazing diversity of life, even between like closely related species of birds. You see, like, there's so much competition that they get so incredibly creative in their behaviors and their color patterns and all the huge amount of life. It's not a monoculture. And I think it really makes for a diverse and beautiful environment, and it fosters lots of invention in a natural system, right? And I see capitalism, when it's allowed to operate that way, But when you have, monopolies controlling the market and collaborating on, price fixing in these things, it makes it very hard for new invention
Yeah.
or any competing. In
So
fact, who was it? One of the Rockefellers, I believe, said competition is a sin, which I really disagree with.
he would say that.
Yeah, yeah. And
Although
so,
I have to say, free market capitalism hasn't existed in a long time, because there's no free markets. Capitalism that I can see, most of them are quite well governed, either through import taxes or through trade agreements that favor one country or
right.
one industry over the other. It's not true. It's not true free market capitalism. That was in the 1800s maybe. And even then, the crown was already regulating the market.
Well, yeah, we've seen a very slow creep, which seems to be accelerating now in that changing. I also am a big um, fan of the whole idea of independence. When the colonists broke away from England, and declared independence in 1776, it was a huge sea change for the whole world. We'd never seen anything like that. And I think it spurred all kinds of innovation, and that freedom allowed them
Yes.
to innovate, and it affected the rest of the world. And it's ironic to me that those innovations that and the technology that have been allowed to be created from that,
Mm.
100 years, 200 years later, are the very tools that are being used against the general populace, not just in America, but around the world. So when you're saying, you're
Yeah.
starting to see the demise of it, I think it has been creeping that way because it hasn't been allowed to operate freely.
Yeah. Well, the tools are only that. They're tools, how they're being used. That's a different question.
Right.
And that depends on the motivation of the operator, right?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, you can use your knife to make yourself a sandwich, or stab your ex-girlfriend, so to speak.
Right.
The knife's a knife. Yeah.
Right, right. It's
Um,
exactly. In fact, that's the argument that a lot of people try to use against the Second Amendment and gun ownership in the United States, and people are like, guns
yeah.
are inherently bad, and no tool. It's just a power tool. It does have a specific purpose, for self-defense if you're using it morally, ethically, correctly, but it can also be used offensively. And
Although I can see, in the point, if the point of the guns, I can see where the pacifist argument comes in, because a gun's only objective is to kill. It just depends what you're aiming it at.
right, but
A knife is like a multi-purpose tool, whereas a gun specifically, it just shoots a projectile at something. Yeah.
true, it does have that purpose, but it also can be a great equalizer. For example, women
And
who
that
are
moral strength comes in. What's the moral purpose, right? And are you taking a life, or are you not taking a life, and what for?
or stopping a threat.
Yeah.
But yes,
What? Yeah.
I can see both sides of that. I tend, being American, I tend to lean towards the argument that it's well, for example, out of the
Self-defense, I'm
United
all for it.
yeah, out of it was one of the things that the founding fathers in the U.S. uh, made darn sure that was built into the Constitution, and in the Second Amendment, in order that they wouldn't undergo the same sort of tyrannical rule that they experienced prior to 1776, with the British troops coming over there.
Yeah.
They wanted to make sure that the population could defend itself and have a militia in the absence of a standing military, force at all times. And it was the general, the citizens, the average citizens, a lot of them who fought in the war, eventually putting on uniforms, but they were, farmers, a lot of them, and just people that believed in, getting themselves out from under a really bad tyranny. It was,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that guarantee, is the human right to self-defense, to be able to at least somewhat match the opposing power. And what's interesting, what's telling is out of the United Nations, there was a statement, I'll have to look it up, but they said that the ability of citizenry to own weapons undermines the legitimate power monopoly of the state.
Yep, that's
Which,
exactly the point.
yeah, and then I think that's exactly the point, and that's why, because the state can become too large and
Yeah,
not working in the interest of the people,
yeah.
and
Who controls the
start setting their
controller?
own
Yeah,
agenda, right?
yeah.
It's an ongoing debate. I fully realize that, not everybody is ever going to be all on the same page with it, I'm sure, but you really have a unique experience,
Mm.
growing up where you did, and now you're living in a free
Well,
Western democratic
well,
society.
I'm at the moment I'm stuck on an island.
Yeah. Right?
um, well, we often laugh about this one with my friends and my comrades from back in the East German days. I basically moved 19,000 kilometers southeast to again be stuck in a country without getting out, without having to fold over backwards for the government. Not knocking it. We over the last year we got away way later than most of the world in this charade.
So here we are today, and we're starting to see there are many parallels, if not outright things that would look like predictions coming
Mm.
from the novel Brave New World, as well as 1984.
I think you can chuck them together because one
Yeah,
is more on
well,
the political side and one is social engineering, isn't it?
yeah,
Uh,
Aldous Huxley and George Orwell had conversations about which scenario they thought was most likely. They must have been thinking of this as a future possible scenario, right? Or
mhm.
was it a blueprint? Was it something that they planned for? Talk a little bit about the history of those individuals and those whole leading up to the idea of Brave New World in 1984.
Well, okay. Well, Brave New World was written in 33, if I'm correct. If I'm correct on this one,
I
32 or
believe so.
33. So that's before World War II, and that's before anything else in Europe really had kicked off in yeah as an industrial war, because World War One was the prelude to this one. World War II being the actual first industrial war on a massive scale, and Aldous Huxley being from the aristocracy, with especially back in those days the right to govern, the God-given right to govern, and the status in the society within society being predetermined by your birth. He basically wrote it from that point. From his point of view, the reason why there is only a couple of alphas, a couple of world controllers, is because that's their right, and because they don't want to have any interference from the epsilons. I don't know. I'm referring to the characters in the book, or the
Right.
social
For those
engineering.
who haven't read Brave New
Um,
World, who were the Epsilons?
the as well, essentially the society was engineered with the alphas on top, and then the alpha minus, and beta plus, beta minus was the upper management, and then all the way down the bottom were the epsilons, which were the working bees, shall we say, the poor
Yes.
bastards, working class, which were in the process of development. They weren't born by mothers anymore. They were born in a factory,
Right.
and
Created in artificial
systematically like
wombs.
starved of oxygen and exposed to toxins in order for them to not develop too much brain matter, but feel at home in bad conditions. And then basically they were only expected to live like 30 years. I'm not sure how far I want to get into this one now, but yeah,
Yeah.
there was a social drug called Soma, which was explicitly given to everyone in small quantities in order to stop any emotional disturbances
Right.
within the person and within society. And at the end of your lifespan, basically over 30, when you're over the hill, you were given an overdose and then disposed of.
Calling to mind other movies like Logan's Run, where you have a
Yep.
predetermined lifespan, about 35, I think it was, and then you
Yep.
go to quote carousel, a big
That's the
celebration
one.
where
Yeah. Yeah.
you're
The
terminated.
lottery for the island or something. That's gotta go. And I said the island, isn't it? With the
Y-
clones.
Yeah, they were going to America, quote
Yeah.
America, after they had a lifetime of Olympic level fitness training. Yeah, the best, healthiest ones got to go. And come to find out, they were actually going to cryogenic preservation, being hung up on in freezers on meat hooks for organ harvesting. So that was a dark movie. If you're just tuning in, this is John Verd on Liberty Now on air, 96.9 Plains FM in Christchurch. Please be sure to subscribe on iTunes at Liberty Now on air, and you can get the links, files, and show notes for this episode at libertynow.com. So the overall idea, the premise of Brave New World is a managed society, right? Controlled from before birth, if you can call it birth, when they're, raised artificially without mothers. And then I see, this sort of Marxist ideology, the family unit needs to be abolished, right?
Yes, all church, like anything that takes the focus of the government, basically, and that included, like, we grew up without churches pretty much. There was churches around, and the occasional person would go in there, but in general, they were kept as a minority.
That's an actual stated written plan, right? This is like how we want to form society. So that kind of parallels with that thinking in Brave New World. But also, more recently, fast forward to the Black Lives Matter movement, which, so many people who haven't really looked deeply into it think it's this wonderful movement. And, from the outside, it looks like, yeah, we need to create equality, and it looks like a great idea. But you look at the ideology of the very founders, and on their own website, it actually said that we want to abolish the nuclear family. They said that. I mean, and in fact, once people started pointing that out from the right, it disappeared from their website. I was able to get it from the archives, and I've got that. Actually, I should probably post that on the website. And the founders themselves are avowed Marxists, and I believe they're also into Wicca or some kind of Wiccan practice. Definitely the occult.
Yeah, to be honest, though, occult just means hidden, no? Whereas those guys, they're not really hiding anything. They're literally want to create a society, basically trying to play God instead of letting things work naturally. They're trying to establish an order of sorts. But I mean, from here we probably get into more the psychology of things. That
well, and if you really get down to it, there's so many different things happening, but it really kind of, at the end of the day, it is a very basic philosophy, isn't it? Should we dictate how society runs? Should we play God, or should we allow free market or nature to evolve culture and be inventive and let people be free to think and determine their own future? And I think if you wanted to get down to it, there is that sort of that struggle, right? The unwashed masses, generally, most of them want to be free, but I think they've given up a lot of their control by getting sucked into technology and entertainment. So they're not actively thinking about, preserving their freedoms.
I think freedom is actually a harder way for most people. The golden cage is way better an alternative.
It is easier, isn't it?
If you ask, well, this got nothing to do with either of those books at the moment. But if you think about the one little bit in the Matrix, I'm not a huge big fan of that movie, because there's some subtle undertones in there that I don't like. Yeah. But there's the one guy who took the red pill and woke up, and then he hated every minute of it, and in the end he betrays the guys and wants to get reinserted in the Matrix. It's easier to live in blissful ignorance than well, it seems easier, it seems more comfortable, because and essentially, this is how I see it, is as long as we're childlike individuals that blame the outside world for all the shortcomings, we will always have to have a father or mother person or figure of some sort that will tell us what to do, and that's what most people do. They look for an authority figure to get instructions, right?
Yeah.
But that's childlike behavior. That's not a grown up.
Absolutely. You're totally,
So in order to grow up, you have to be responsible for all your actions and for everything in your life. That doesn't mean you're responsible that, for example, it rains on your head when you're outside, but you're responsible enough to put a cape on or get a fucking umbrella or something. Excuse the swear word.
yeah.
But
No,
you know what I mean? It's
absolutely.
the like, oh, the government makes it rain every Friday. Yeah, poor me. That kind of victim childhood this is a childish mentality or a
Yes,
childlike mentality.
absolutely. You're
And
going
it's
right
and,
down
it,
the
and
path.
it's ever since the 60s. I think in the late 60s was the last time, well, with the student revolts in the States because of the Vietnam War,
Yeah,
which went worldwide in the end, and it caused a lot of upheaval, um, even on our side, where on the communist side, because people started questioning authority. It wasn't,
right.
it didn't go unnoticed, even though it was probably sponsored by the Marxists in the States, to get a bit upset about the Vietnam War and to rally the young people, but because the
Right.
intellectuals were still thinking on by themselves back then, yeah, and taking independent action, which was dangerous. That
Right.
won't
They
happen. It won't
cared, they
happen,
cared about
again.
what happened in the world. They were involved in politics.
Yeah, that won't
They
happen
were
again.
always, they
They
were
learned
looked
they
down
learned that
by
lesson.
the mainstream politicians, these crazy
Yeah,
kids. The protests back then were about, like a righteous cause, like
yeah.
innocent people were being killed. Soldiers were being set off to a war, an unnecessary war in what ultimately was probably more a commercial interests than
Always
and
is. That's what war always is about.
yeah,
It's always about commercial interests. The moment you step outside your borders, you're not defending your country, you're invading. All wars are started usually for conquest, right? Even the
right,
Roman Empire, that was for commercial interests. It just looked a bit different. Uh,
right,
but
yeah,
essentially, it was for the slave labor or for the stones in the quarries of Galicia or whatever, but
right.
or the olive oil from Greece or whatever else, yeah, gold, yeah.
Yep, yep, all about resources and, sold to the general population, under the name of patriotism, but I think those kinds of wars have been very few and far between. Possibly make some arguments, to justify America's involvement in World War II, but they were really sucked into it, and ultimately, the Britain was, complicit in that too, where they were actually talking to Hitler before the outbreak, before the invasion of Poland.
So,
They were in negotiations talking about, oh, well, which countries you can invade and which not. So, I mean, it's not like
I
England.
mean, if you go into nitty gritty, yeah, essentially the only guys that are winners in all the wars are the big industrialists, and they are the ones that
Absolutely.
were pushing the war for starters. If nobody like, let's put it this way: if the states didn't want to have, or it's not even the states, if the multinationals at that stage, General Motors, Texas Oil, if they didn't want to have a war at their hands, they would have just not supplied the additive that was needed to make all the tanks run, for make all the diesel
Right.
to actually make the diesel operational. They could have just stopped it,
Right.
and it would have been the end of the Russian tanks and the German ones and everyone else in between.
Yeah, and there's a long history going back to, even pre-Civil War days where the industrialists who stood to gain, like from munitions producers.
A German manufacturer at the end of World War One. Yeah, like he got trialed for it. Thyssen, his name was Thyssen, and that was because he was selling the his cannons to both the French and the German military.
Right.
Uh,
Right. If the military, the worker bees, as you say, are aware of this, I think there would be more voting for the people who don't do that. We would abolish these things if we just
yeah,
shed enough light on them. There was a really famous quote, well, actually, a whole speech from Dwight Eisenhower as he was leaving office. You may have seen it, where he was warning about the dangers of the
Yep.
increasingly powerful military industrial complex.
He coined that phrase, the military industrial complex. That was,
Yeah.
I think, one of the first times that was out in public.
It's a lot of what we see that's happening in the world with this corruption, at least, is the Latin phrase "qui bono," right? Who benefits? If you follow the money, you're very likely to see the real root causes of these things. In the case of the military industrial complex, these missiles, many of them have been built with like a shelf life, so which ensures their future production,
Of
and
course.
purchasing from the government if you put a shelf life on it. And then, of course, you can only stockpile so many of these things before
Yep.
you need to get rid of them or come out with version 2.0, cruise missile
That's right.
version 5.
Right.
Well,
Yep.
how are you going to get rid of them? Well, we need a war.
Once a quarter on the shooting range.
Right. Yeah.
It's the same everywhere.
Yep.
I think what one issue that we have is that we get roped in. Nothing wrong with keeping an eye on politics and the small game that's being played, but it's like when you play chess and you only keep looking at the pawns, how they move, and you forget that there's a couple of figures behind that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's actually where I was kind of going with the topic of today's show, the Brave New World versus the 1984 scenarios. So you have the military industrial complex, the masters of industry and commerce, and, they're corrupt enough, in their dealings with, bribing government officials and lobbyists and these things. But above them, there are, the people who are really pulling the strings of society.
Sure.
I think then you start to get into the bankers, with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, I believe. There's a really good book about that for anybody who hasn't read it, The Creature from Jekyll Island, where they got together the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and some of the other industry leaders.
Woodrow Wilson, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was the puppet that sold it to the American government, and he actually later regretted it. He was, once he saw what it really caused.
Did he marry into one of the families? That's why he got.
Yeah, whoever controls the money supply or the value of the money rules the world, right? And that's all the time we have for in this episode. Thank you for listening. It's been a really interesting conversation with Holger Riga. We will continue this conversation next week. If you'd like to hear more, please tune in next Saturday at 96.9 Plains FM or at Liberty Now on air and get the podcast for free. Until next time, keep asking questions and be good.